a.m. phone call was when Colonel Wood called and said, we're in danger of being overrun. We need to stay in Benghazi. And she was in charge of the State Department. She had them come home. And I think she left our ambassador defenseless. And that's an incredibly important question. And that was her 3 a.m. phone call. She advertised against President Obama, said he wouldn't know what to do in a 3 a.m. phone call. I don't think she did know what to do.
Do you feel that that was addressed yesterday?
A little bit. I mean, there was some discussion of it, but to me it's always been the most important thing is for 9 months leading up to the assassination in Benghazi, there were multiple requests, not one or two.
She says they didn't come to her.
Dozens of requests.
She says she didn't see them. That's the Secretary of State, that those are handled at a lower level.
I know, but she's in charge. She was the Secretary of State. She's in charge of all of that. When you're President of the United States, there are a lot of people that work for you, but ultimately if we go to war, we have a disaster in war, the President is to blame. The President does deserve both credit and blame because they're in charge.
You know what's interesting about this conversation is that it mirrors the same one that some people like Donald Trump are having about George W. Bush during 9/11. How much responsibility do presidents or secretaries bear for a surprise terror attack? Do you see these as parallel? Is George W. Bush responsible for 9/11 in the same way?
Well, I think ultimately we have to start with the terrorists are responsible.
Of course.
And then once we get beyond that, there are some parallels. You know, we looked at very extensively 9/11, what led up to 9/11, and to me what was always the biggest mistake is we caught the 20th hijacker a month in advance of 9/11. We didn't do anything about it. So ultimately, yes, the FBI made some mistakes.
And did George W. Bush?
Well, ultimately, he is responsible for the FBI and for all of government. But some of it bleeds over into Bill Clinton as well. So there's a lot of blame to go around for these things. I think in this case, specifically requests were made for more security, and they were denied, and that is on Hillary Clinton's watch.
Let's talk about your takeaway from yesterday, this 11-hour marathon. I know, of course, you didn't get to see all of it. You are doing something called Running for President. But, you know, what's interesting is that you are a small government guy. You rail against big government. You rail against waste. Has this been a proper use of $4.5 million taxpayer dollars?
I think we do have to learn from history. So, for example, we should learn that Hillary's war in Libya was a disaster for our country and has made us less safe. It's made the region more chaotic. And if we don't learn that, how are we going to know what to do now in Syria? But the same goes for the Iraq war. I think George Bush's decision to go into Iraq for the first Iraq war was a big mistake. And I think they're parallel. Both times we toppled a secular dictator. Both times we got chaos. We still have chaos 15 years after the Iraq war.
Okay, so these hearings, this 11-hour hearing and how it's gone on for some 18 months, that has been an adequate use of $4.5 million taxpayer dollars.
I think it's a way to learn from history. And the most important thing is we need to know that when we have a mission overseas, we have to defend it. And it needs to have adequate security. And I think what we're learning is under Hillary Clinton's watch, she did not provide the adequate security, even though it was not one time, not two times, but probably a dozen times they asked for more help, and it was denied by Hillary Clinton.
So you don't see this as Republican overreach and a waste of time and money?
If we learn from history, I think it's really important because we're always talking about getting back involved in the Middle East. And I think it's important to learn that not only did Hillary Clinton not defend Benghazi and the ambassador, she started the war. She was part of it. That's too far. She didn't start the war, but she encouraged our involvement in it. She was probably the key proponent in the administration trying to get President Obama to go to war in Libya, and that was a mistake. That was a terrible, terrible mistake.
So what do you think that all of this and yesterday's hearing does for her presidential campaign?
I don't think it's good for her. I've always said that she's going to have a tough time convincing the American public that she will defend our country because she sent an ambassador into harm's way and didn't provide him with adequate defense.
But do you think, as so many pundits and even conservative ones we've had on the air this morning say that she so comported herself against their arguing, they were squabbling, some of the Republicans were squabbling with Elijah Cummings, and that she seemed more composed. Do you think that helps her?
You know, I think she ran this strong campaign against President Obama saying she'd be there for the 3 a.m. moment. I do think this was her 3 a.m. moment, and when she was called didn't provide adequate security in Benghazi, and she's never getting away from that. I think it will preclude her from being commander-in-chief. I don't think the nation will elect her because she didn't provide an adequate defense for the ambassador.
You're focused on something different than a lot of the Republicans, including Jim Jordan, whom we had on a couple of hours ago. They're focused on the videotape. They're focused on why she said one thing, that it was a terror attack, and then later the administration said it was a videotape. What do you think of that keeps continuing about, was it a videotape, was it a terror attack, was it political spin?
I guess why I'm less interested in what happened in the spin afterwards is I kind of assume politicians to be deceitful and to spin what they do to try to put it in a favorable light. So what is important to me is, why didn't she read the cables? I had one or two questions when I cross-examined her in my committee, and I said, why didn't you, or did you read the cables? And she admitted she didn't. But I don't think it's enough to slough this off to underlings and say, oh, it was somebody else's fault. I was busy traveling. The problem is that Libya was one of the most dangerous places in the world, and it was her job to know that the ambassador was pleading for more help and that the State Department turned him down.
But the fact that some Republicans, like Jim Jordan, are so fixated on the video, are they wasting time?
I think it's important to know the whole story. I mean, one of the things that came out yesterday was that she was sending emails to her daughter that night saying it was a terrorist attack. It is kind of curious that for a whole week, and they went on all the Sunday shows saying, oh, it was about some movie, when they knew initially, and she was already sending an email to her daughter saying it is a terrorist attack. Did someone decide, and let's have a concerted pushback to say this wasn't terrorism?
I know one of the things that you've wondered about in terms of this whole Benghazi thing was why Ambassador Chris Stevens was even in Benghazi. She addressed that yesterday. She said that he went because he wanted to do some reconnaissance. He wanted to get some information out of an insurgency that was happening there. Does that adequately answer your question?
My question has always been is what is the CIA annex doing there? Now, she claimed yesterday in her testimony that the CIA annex had nothing to do with providing arms into Syria. This is very important. She claimed that she has no knowledge and that it wasn't occurring, that the CIA annex had nothing to do with funneling arms into Syria. I don't believe that to be true. I don't think she's being honest with us, and I think the CIA annex did have something to do with routing arms into Syria. Whether or not it was the CIA or they were using a proxy, they were gathering up arms in Libya. They were looking for 15,000 man-pads, surface-to-air missiles, and they were gathering them up. But what were they doing with them, and were they a conduit to arms in Syria? I think they were.
She addressed that yesterday. Let's play that moment.
Aware, or are you aware of any efforts by the U.S. government in Libya to provide any weapons, either directly or indirectly, or through a cutout, to any Libyan rebels or militias or opposition to Gaddafi's forces?
That was a very long question, and I think the answer is no.
Were you aware, or are you aware of any U.S. efforts by the U.S. government in Libya to provide any weapons, directly or indirectly, or through a cutout, to any Syrian rebels or militias or opposition to Syrian forces?
No.
She says no. Is she lying?
Well, here's the interesting thing. The New York Times has reported for years and years that the CIA has been funneling arms into Syria. What was the CIA annex doing in Libya? That question wasn't completely addressed there.
I mean, she says, obviously, she didn't run the CIA. She ran the State Department.
She kind of says that. But I
I
can tell you that what I've read in the newspaper is consistent also what people are talking about in hearings in Washington. So the CIA has been involved with getting arms into Syria. That's well-known knowledge. What was the CIA annex doing in Libya? The reason it's an important question is, why did the ambassador go to a remote consulate very near a CIA annex? What was going on with the CIA annex? There were reports in the New York Times and other papers that a Turkish ship left Libya a day or two before, full of arms, and they have interviews with the Syrian rebels getting the arms off of the ship, saying, you know, disputing over who got what arms. So this is all out there, and the fact that she's still denying it, she could say it's classified, she can't talk about it, but the fact that she's denying it, I wonder whether or not she's telling the truth.
One quick question about the presidential race and the new poll that has come out, the Des Moines Register, just this morning. Let me show you how voters in Iowa caucuses are feeling. Ben Carson has leapfrogged Donald Trump. This is the second time in 2 days that we've seen this. He's at 28%. Donald Trump is at 19%. You are, I believe, fifth at 5%. These numbers.
I think that the polls are still a jumble. I think they're very loose polls of people leaning one way or another. I think they will change many more times. Herman Cain was leading at this point, you know, in 2012. In 2008, Rudy Giuliani was up for 5 months and never won a primary. So I think it's still very early. We like the fact that we're in the middle. We seem to think we're going up a little bit, and we hope that that's true. But we have a strong ground game. We think we have the strongest organization in Iowa right now.
You do, and does that go as far or farther than the appeal with evangelicals? How do you think that you do with them?
It's a little bit of both, and we, I am socially conservative as well as fiscally conservative, and so we have appeal across the board. We also appeal to students, independents, because we don't think it's a good idea to be back at war.